Let's get straight to uh, what our session is about, and let's just first try to get introduced about the work our distinguished guests have done. So, Dr. Chaudhuri, would you take us through a little bit of your work, specifically focusing on uh, how did you try to make rice better? Okay.
So I started by working on genetic recombination, which is the method by which you can change the genome. That I started in the late 70s when we were just, the whole idea actually came forward. But then the question, of course, that why do you want to make the changes? So I slowly gravitated towards plant science, first into Arabidopsis, which is a mustard family model plant, sort of like a Drosophila of the plant world. So I did a lot of work in that. That was in the U.S. and we established an Arabidopsis lab in the biology department at MIT. But because I had grown up in a rice growing area in Bangladesh, I started on the side working on rice, and then I moved to Australia. But slowly and more and more, I kept on working on rice by coming here. So I had a parallel operation which has now become very big, the village-based sort of production of rice variety, which is separate from the government initiative.
Okay. And since you also have you have a very eclectic interest, of course, in many, many things, also tell us, so right now we are having a discussion on genetics, etc., right? And I think there's a serious issue, and I think you would be able to speak about the Bangladesh situation, on what is the status of understanding in terms of how genes or for that matter, how life works. Could you reflect on that, and does it matter?
Yeah, it matters very much, and in the popular society, the word gene is very well known. So I'm known in this country as gene scientist, although people don't have any details idea of what gene is. But everywhere I go, people say it's gene scientist. So, so the interest is very much there. And then these days, a lot of people are interested in genetically modified food, GMO, because it's been thrown around the word a lot, or hybrid. So all these buzzwords are very much into the public consciousness, but people don't necessarily know what it actually means. The detailed understanding of it is missing. The whole evolutionary biology of how one species led to another, in this there is also a lot of interest, but again the detailed understanding very much is not there. So when I started to work in Bangladesh, I took a lot of effort in explaining people what the gene is, codon, the code, because a lot of interest in computer science and coding, but a lot of people don't know that the biologists first used this word, codon, anticodon, coding sequence. So this is another thing which you are sort of talking in an open-ended way, that there is a great relationship between codon and encryption and actually biology. So slowly we have started a journey. It's just not Bangladesh alone, in the US, Australia, in the lay people, so-called lay people who didn't study science. There's very poor understanding of the details. So we have to work on this.
So Professor Jain, could you discuss briefly about your work, kind of the major highlights of your work spanning psychiatry and genetics? Why do we need to know genetics? Because psychiatry is all in the mind.
Thank you all for being here. As Gargo knows, I'm a doctor. I work in a big mental hospital, one of the biggest in India, at least in terms of money. We see about 400,000 patients a year. It's a very large service. And like any doctor, you start talking to people and learning their histories and their family histories. And it soon becomes obvious to any clinician that mental illnesses like hypertension and diabetes runs in families. So if you have a relative, you're more likely, blah, blah, blah. So you can see that if you are in the same family, you're more likely to have a similar kind of illness. What is the basis for that? Why does that occur? And over the last 25 years, when the tools or the technology of genetic science improved, we thought we should start applying these technologies to better understand as to why people fall in, and what happens to them, what happens to their bodies, what happens to their brains, why do certain people get better, why don't other people get so much improved with medicine. So our effort over the last 20 years has been mainly to identify the causes and how genes interact with the risk of disease and how people recover from the disease. At the same time, you start recognizing that there are many severe illnesses like Huntington disease or various kinds of neurological syndromes or mental handicap syndromes which are caused by single gene defects. And if you have that, then your life is going to be considerably shortened. You're going to be ill for a large part of your life. And although we've discovered the genes, and we haven't discovered most of them, how they work and why they do that, we have no idea. The brain is trapped inside this. We cannot test the brain. We cannot do a blood test for your brain. You cannot take a biopsy from your brain. You can only image it. You can imagine another person's brain. You can imagine actually another person's mind. You can never actually imagine another person's brain. So you have to look at new methods as to how you're going to understand what's happening deep inside this barrier. And genetics is a wonderful way to do that because all of us have the same genes. We may have different opinions, we may have different minds, we may have different languages, but inside this, it's all the same. So therefore, understanding what goes on in here, to me, made complete medical sense. So that's what we've been doing.
So, and right now, after this, I throw the discussion open in a way, so you feel free to go back and forth. So, as Dr. Chaudhary said, we hear the words, genes, etc. It's kind of very easily thrown about, and it's fine that it's entering public lingo, and it's probably replacing the other gene which is known in this part of the world. So that's kind of good in a certain way.
Dr. Levi, is that?
No. JWIN gene. So it's kind of a quasi-spirit-like character. So, and that I think is a good move. Having said that, what would you think when a buzzword enters, they also come in public media through kind of fantastic promises of now genes will solve this and genes will solve that, which almost gives a kind of agency to this thing, as if it is actually the older gene, as if it will do things, right? So could you actually, taking a stock of where the technology stands and where science stands, to give us a realistic idea of what are genes doing in today's world which are beneficial to people at large?
Yeah, so this is not science, but you touched on something very interesting, which is the word gene. So in this country and perhaps in the Muslim world and developing world, people who know a bit of Arabic, they know this word gene. So the word at least is not unknown, right? So gene bhoot, gene farishta, gene insan, and all those things. So when I started to work in my village, which is a lot of religious people, they were not unhappy. They didn't find this word difficult, but then I had to explain to them how different it was. So it's kind of a semantic thing, but word people already knew. So coming back more seriously to GENE gene, which is the gene of genetics, that everything has a genetic program. The gene for curly hair and the gene for straight hair in girls. So I try to explain it that one single mutation in the keratin protein changes curly hair from straight hair. And people related to it very well. It has never been said like this before. It has never been introduced. It could have been introduced in kindergarten or class 6 or class 3 or something. One of my friend, a good friend from America, he cloned the zebrafish gene, which originally George Strassinger picked up from the Ganges River and established the whole field of zebrafish genetics in America. And he was my professor in University of Oregon, and he told me how he just went into the river Ganga on the other side of the border, and he picked up this black fish, which he later propagated in America. And the reason this is interesting is that one of my friends later got a mutation, which is the golden zebrafish. And when he cloned the gene, it was the same gene which controls skin color in human being, in between Europeans and Africans. So this is the gene that was mutated when people came out of Africa, went to Europe, and they were dying because sunlight was not entering their body, and then this mutation occurred. So as we work, and then of course the rice gene, because short rice versus long rice, basmati versus tulsi mala, which is the tiny little thing, and the basmati is the longest grain. So I for about 12 years, I went to village bazaars and little school and took with me the tulsi mala rice and the basmati rice and picked a girl which has curly hair and straight hair. So we sort of talk like that. And very soon I found that it was entering, because a lot of people came to me and said, "Sir, আমি gene নিয়ে কাজ করতে চাই. I want to work with genes." And then people would, little boys would come and their pocket was full of crumpled papers which has some theory written how genetics was not true or genetics was true. So it was entering in a very folk wisdom kind of way into the public sense of innovation.
So coming from the more medical perspective, what's a realistic stock taking at this point of time? Is genetic medicine a real thing, or will ever be a real thing? What are we doing?
Well, that's a very large canvas. All of us are familiar with vaccinations and immunizations. That's a product of genetic knowledge. If you have cancer, if you're unlucky enough to have cancer, you'll be lucky that we understand genetics, because certain kind of cancers can be treated completely once you know the genetic basis of that cancer and you administer the appropriate genetically modified treatment for that particular cancer in that particular person. So with the use of genetic technologies, we've been able to master at least a few diseases, perhaps a dozen at best right now. But the complexity of life forms is such that the actual answers are still, despite all our advances, are still miles and miles away. But you see, if you look at it in a completely different way, electromagnetic radiation-dependent communication was invented sometime in 1930 by Marconi and J.C. Bose, if people believe in Bengali primalism. But now, all of you are using cell phones. The technology change from Marconi to every person in this room having a cell phone has taken 50 years, and that's it. If you take aeroplanes, first aeroplane invented in 1905, this conference would not have been possible without an aeroplane. Okay? So in 100 years, these technologies have changed the way we communicate, the way we think about things. And DNA technology was invented, or DNA itself was discovered only in 1952, and the technologies to manipulate it are being discovered in the last 10 years. In the next 50 years, if that trajectory of technology change occurs in the field of genetic intervention, genetic technologies, I really cannot predict what the future will be. Just like a person in 1920 could not predict that everybody would walk around with cell phones, we are in that same position now. We have no idea what the future holds. We cannot actually even begin to imagine the limits at which genetic technologies can be used for the good and for the bad. One must realize both things. If you can have personalized medicines, you can also have personalized poisons. If you can have personalized interventions for preserving life, you can also have personalized interventions for taking away life. Who's going to make those decisions for you? How is that power going to rest? Who is going to exercise those powers is going to be a critical question for the near future.
So if I can briefly follow up on that, in a way, I have often looked upon these kind of pre-explosion kind of ethical time points as being able to not do the mistakes what the humankind did with atomic bombs or atomic energy, right? So what is a kind of a path, in a way? The atomic bomb, we had it and then we decided, okay, now what do we do, right? But is there a serious reverse way of dealing with this?
Can I answer this with a kind of a joke?
Yeah.
Professor Hug will be familiar with it. There's a person called Eric Cantor who did a whole lot of genomic sequencing. But many years ago when I heard him, he had this brilliant idea. What if humankind could be convinced to not wear clothes, number one, which is not very difficult, but also have chlorophyll genes put into their own genome so that they could synthesize their own food? Now, half the problem of the world would be solved. You would no longer have to farm. You no longer have to fight for land. All you need to do when you are hungry is take off your clothes and stand in the sun. Full stop. It sounds science fictionist, but with CRISPR technologies and with appropriate genetic tools, we now realize that it could actually be done. Do we really want all of us to be a uniform green? Not uniform green, after plants are very diverse, but green of various shades. But we could actually do this. Now, should we do this? I leave that to the audience.
So, Professor Chaudhary, I think just to take the discussion forward, this also you talked about how food interventions and nutritional or kind of resistant interventions have come from genetic technologies in rice in this part of the world and various other things. And of course, there is the active live debate about GMO.
Yes.
Yeah, genetically modified, for people who are not familiar with the idea, that a product is being genetically modified for ostensibly for some betterment over from what it is being modified from. Of course, there are commercial interest questions, etc. What's your view on the subject, especially just to flag one kind of concern which I hear at times, is that we do not have enough long-term data to know what these things might do. But I would want you to probably respond more broadly, but also keeping that question in mind.
Yeah, so this issue that we just don't know enough to make changes, and therefore let's not make changes. This is a very powerful argument in the public domain, not among the scientists, but so-called lay people or general people. And this was brought home very strongly recently when I went to a conference on wheat blast, which is one of the most noxious fungus which wipes out the whole wheat, and this just happened in Bangladesh last year. And I was suggesting that we actually have the technology to make this fungus and other obnoxious things like mosquito for dengue and other things, completely wipe them out using a phenomenon called meiotic drive or gene drive together with CRISPR. So you can set in motion a process and there will be no mosquito for dengue anymore. You can wipe it out. And you can wipe it out many other totally obnoxious things, which is wiping out human beings and crops and so on. And in the general audience, the response was very negative. He said, who are you to say this? How do you know what this will happen, et cetera, et cetera. And these organizers, because I was kind of a wild cannon, I suppose, I was just saying those things. And the organizers later said, don't even say it, because somebody will report that we are thinking of doing it, and then it will become a very big thing. So coming back to GMO, this is the same way. Like when you do crosses, what is known as wide crosses to develop the new varieties of wheat, you cross two wheat lines which are separated from each other for billions of years, and the amount of genetic havoc it creates is absolutely, 10,000 times more than what happens when you introduce one gene and create what is known as the GMO. So people are very much pathologically and kind of a fear response. It's like halal food, because, or the Hindu people don't want to have beef. It's not a scientifically based objection, it's an ethically and spiritually based objection. And people don't want to understand any logic. So some people are just spiritually against introducing a daffodil gene into rice gene or something. I suggested that I'll stay in a shopping mall and every day I will eat GM food. But I will not sell GM food at the face of objection and not tell people there is GM food, because that's not ethical. So when I do rice breeding, and because I'm known to be a gene scientist, people immediately conclude that I'm doing GMO, right? If I was just a poet or a literature student selling rice, they would never ask this. They always come and ask me that, are you doing GMO? And when I tell them I'm not doing GMO, they still don't listen. So I think GMO obsession or the feeling against GMO is not a scientifically based feeling. It's the same kind of feeling that if thousands of people are given a glass of water where you drop a plastic spider. So it's a plastic spider. It's nothing to do with, it's not contaminating the water. Most people will not drink that water because the sight of spider set in motion some atavistic region of the brain which is related to primal fear and so on. So I think a lot of technology, there's a Luddite philosophy. People are inherently against technology. So the public perception of science is a bit like triggering that sort of fear and not based on any rational appreciation of the science itself.
But what about the concern that we do not know long-term implications?
I don't think it's fair to say. I mean, this is true for anything. I mean, you don't know what will happen to you eventually if you eat a lot of cucumber or potato or carrot. I mean, who can guarantee that if you eat a lot of carrot, you're not going to develop brain cancer? Because the hypothetical cancer-inducing substance in carrot probably hasn't been discovered yet. So you can say this for anything, right? I just gave you an example. People are eating all the time wheat that has been done by the white crosses, where thousands of genes are just expression is being altered. And yet the same people are getting concerned because one gene has been put into wheat. This is not based on any kind of rational analysis, but completely based on the Luddite fear of technology.
Thank you. So, Professor Jain, so as we are hearing that we are probably standing at the brink, so one can almost call it a revolutionary moment, not to make this moment, but it has been coming for a few decades now. We must, in a way, contemplate and take stock of, what this does to society as we know it, right? And I would like to kind of flag something you had written in an article, in a sense that we do live in a world of inequities. We do live in a world where technology transfer happens unidirectionally, almost. We live in a world where the translation of medical or any kind of science knowledge from bench to bed is fictional in some cases, but very direct in certain other cases. So I remember in a recent Outlook article, you had said the Indian dream will be an American photocopy. Okay, it was in a very different context, but I feel that what will be the place of the southern world in general vis-a-vis these advances in genetics,
Well, let's start at the bottom then. What you're calling merely the southern world is 70% of the world's population. So let's get that. So we are the world. That is a bigger reality. There is asymmetry by which we have not been equal participants in all these technology fixes of the last 100 years. But before that, I think we were quite integral to that. But I would like to go back to what Professor mentioned about GMOs. Now, this fear, at one level, is also related to the question I raised earlier. Who calls it a GMO? Is humankind a GMO? Are we modifying, if we are willing to modify plants, what if somebody decides to modify us? Can we use the same logic as we are doing to modify the real natural world on ourselves? Are we, in a sense, removing ourselves and putting ourselves at a level different from the rest of life forms? Now, these are actually deep spiritual questions. And therefore, some of the fear of GMO is actually playing with that. As has been correctly pointed out, if you look out the window, most of the trees that are grown in your campus are not from India. They are from Brazil, they are from Madagascar, they are from all over the world. So, and more changes have been produced in the environment here by bringing in foreign genetic material than whatever little genetic material we would handle under a microscope on pure conditions. So we have already been subjected to this. So what, and has it made us worse? So this fear has to be, in a sense, tempered. But the very real concern that the methods of producing GMO, or the methods by which, let's say, the organism changes, and how that changes in protein structure, will then change the further behavior of the organism. These are very real questions. Now, to put it in a different perspective, when India was irrigated, by India I mean British India was irrigated, they also will bring food. But if you talk to a doctor, that is what caused the spread of malaria uniformly all over India. Malaria was confined to certain pockets, but irrigation made it spread to corners of India which had never had malaria before. Now, depending on whom you want to listen to, the food specialists say irrigation saved the famines. We didn't starve anymore. Somebody else will say the rivers have been connected. There's long-term water security for our nation. You talk to the doctor, it produced malaria. Now, which of these three opinions are you going to be importantly looking at? So we have to realize that each of these questions will have different kinds of answers depending on the listener's viewpoints. And we have to give respect to that diversity. I cannot even imagine giving a unified answer to this, because I can see GMO working for getting better antibiotics, for eliminating disease vectors. I think that would be brilliant. But what will actually happen to the birds that live on insect feeders if all the mosquitoes disappear and the disappearance of the birds? What will it cause to the ecological cycle of the world? I have no idea. And I think those questions will come up sometime or the other. If I eliminate all the mosquitoes in the world, what will the birds eat? When they die, what will happen to us? That's also a question.
Yeah. So,
I just wanted
yeah,
to.
Oh, sorry, I forgot the American dream.
yes, could you, and then we could come to.
I'll just take a minute. I'll
Yeah,
just take
sure.
1 minute. The idea was that the kind of hyper-consumption, harsh individualism that is being propagated in the current wave of post-capitalist marketing, and how we can fight over language as long as you all buy Samsung. If we can fight about everything, we'll change the name boards of everything, but we will not change the stamp on the speed board, on the speedometer. That has to be in English. The made in Korea, made in Japan, the Toshiba, the Land Rover can be owned by an Indian, assembled in China, but it has to be Land Rover in English. Tata will sell the same car called Sumo in India, and they call it Gurkha in London, because in India, the Japanese are good, in Britain, the Gurkhas are good. So this kind of fractionation will occur, but it will all, unless we are careful, we'll be divided into bits that are served on the table, but we'll never be at the table. And for that, you have to participate in the field. You have to participate in the science and the technology and the information flow. Otherwise, you'll be pieces on the table. You'll never be at the table.
So one thing I think people often don't think about is that how did we come to this earth? I mean, what is the narrative of the human stay and the human propagation on earth? So it's becoming very clear since some of the recent papers that a few thousand people probably came out of Africa, maybe about 60,000 years ago. And then they mated with a pre-existing hominin, they call it human-like, but interfertile groups like Neanderthals and so on, and became into different, what we call ethnicity. In all likelihood, though no one is coming forward and saying it because it's not politically correct, but in all likelihood, what constitutes the human major differences, like we look at a Korean person and say he's not from Finland, this is obvious. Scandinavians look different from the Hopis, and the Hopis look different from the Hottentots, and so on. So what is it due to? And in all likelihood, it's due to this mating, the human hominin mating. So if you think like that, what is the particularism about being a Bengali and a Korean? I mean, we pretend that God or nature has created all these different ethnic groups separately in a very special way. And this is why we were talking about the plant. I mean, how dare you bring Australian plant in here? Almost saying like it's a sacrilege and Australian plants will not be able to grow in Bangladesh. And how dare you speak here now in English when you're a Bengali, So this kind of ultra nationalism around language and ethnicity is very strong. But Chomsky, was the first person to point out that in our brain there's a universal grammar. There's no Bengali grammar or Finnish grammar. This is why a Bengali boy or a child taken to Finland is going to be a Finnish-speaking person. And even Zia Haidar Rahman, one of the fellow from my area in Sylhet, and he even was not born in England, but he went there, and he's one of the major writers in English language. He's written a book called In the Light of What We Know, and is considered to be a mega phenomenon. So this is why I think this whole idea about what is foreign and what is local needs to be revisited, because we are talking about now a human race. There's no other race except for human race. And these Homo sapiens people mated with Neanderthals, and 3% of Neanderthal genome remains in Europeans and some in Chinese. These discoveries are central. These are, to me, the mother of all philosophies. And yet, they have not percolated into the thinking of writers, of poets, who are pretending to be a kind of a fuzzy idea about how maybe all the subspecies or ethnic groups who are one day coming separately and definitely from heaven to populate this earth. I think these sorts of social science and humanities is dominated by this kind of thinking, which has no understanding of the mechanism of the human race, and this is a big problem, in my opinion.
So as we kind of, we have spanned quite a bit of ground, for example, knowledge, kind of also knowledge ownership differences between the majority world and the minority world, if you will, and the various kind of fault lines which exist in society in terms of being receptive to what we now know as empirical knowledge. What would you think would be, looking forward, some of the big concerns, just beyond GMO, let's kind of, we have sort of been over with that. What are certain long-term concerns of biotechnology and genetic modification? And I would put that to you, and also put that to you in a way, and that's how you will wrap up, in a sense, what kind of concerns, including ethical concerns, of course, right? You flagged some of them, but if you could talk more broadly, because whenever we are rah-rah about any kind of new thing on the block, though genetics is not quite new, it probably is very old. No, I'm not even talking about modern biotechnology, but the new buzzword around it is quite new. So what kind of ethical concerns would you flag, for example? Let me start with you.
So first, very quickly, I want to say that we need a lot of real information in form of not scientific papers, which no one is going to read, but actually books. And in the light of what you said, I was remembering, I'm reading at the moment the book called The Gene by Siddhartha Mukherjee. Right. And earlier he wrote a book on cancer. And this guy, who is, I'm sure is a Bengali from Calcutta, he is just an outstanding writer, and he has written about gene and the mental disease in such a profound way. So we need to substitute the popular culture of poetry and novelists and so on, who cannot even frame questions like you just asked me because of this lack of knowledge of the thing. Now, coming back to the specific question, I think we start from very serious understanding of how things are, and then we kind of revisit our tradition. And because if you look at, like we were discussing the other day, a lot of Bengali poet we call it Deho Tattva, or the body theory. It said everything is vested in the body. And as a cognitive scientist, you know the work of Damasio and others. It says the same thing. And there's the idea that Descartes was wrong, so Descartes is error. But Lalon and Hassan Raja and even Rabindranath said this kind of thing a long time ago. Except that with the new neurobiology, we are not understanding it in the light of new neurobiology. There's no such effort. And that should be. Similarly with GMO, if we know that natural variation or whatever exists in nature was just a constellation of alleles. And theoretically speaking, with very perfect technology of genome editing, we can recreate all the alleles. Like somebody says the muslin cotton is actually extinct, where you used to make muslin. That particular cotton variety used to grow near an area near Dhaka, and nobody has any seed. It's disappeared. This gossipum species. It's extinct. And recently the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, she called a meeting and she said, oh, how can we get the muslin cotton back? And somebody contacted me because I was working for a long time in cotton, and I said that species is extinct, but you can find its closest relative. And perhaps with dogged effort at genome editing, it's conceptually possible that you can recreate regarding fiber length. So I want to imagine a world in the light of what you're asking and wrapping up. I want to imagine a world where everyone is informed, factually correct of the correct position of us, and the biota, the plants and the animals of the world, has to be factually correct. Because if you're not factually correct, you have a fantastic notion of life form. If you think that you are a master of all the living form, and your job is to completely turn everything into business, like cut a tree and turn it into a table, and that's the only reason the tea exists, then you're going to have a horrific world. And even recently, Bill Gates said it, that we need to save this earth, you need to get socialism back. And in our childhood days or university days, we were studying this kind of thing, ideas of the intellectual socialist, Trotsky and all those people, and Mao and Marx, and nobody even talk about it anymore. But you look at what these touchy-feely environmentalism linked with some notion of socialism, or at least social democracy, leads to better husbandry of the natural world or the biota compared to the rampant capitalism. So I would say we need a political philosophy, we need a natural view, we need the correct narrative, and then everything will be good for us.
What do you think?
I think he's answered most of it, to which I would...
And what about kind of, let's say,
medicine?
Human ethico-spiritual concerns? Right. I think that's something you would...
See, all humankinds have invented medicine. The job of medicine is to preserve health and to reduce the effects of disease. Now, what if we became actually perfect at this? How long would one want to live? How long can we ensure a disease-free life? Can we ensure perpetual life? If we use technologies in a particular way, both of these answers could really be true. We could harbor stem cells, we could grow cells, we could clone you forever and forever and forever and forever endlessly. But obviously, it raises very, very important issues. We have to learn the humility of time, space, and the other biotas. We have to learn the limits to which we can push the science. We have to really wonder as to what are the pragmatic advantages of applying a particular treatment. For example, I'll give you a small example. You've all perhaps heard of stem cell therapies for various diseases. So some time ago, as a replication of something done about 25 years ago in Mexico, or 30 years ago, when they take children's brains who had died, not murdering them, so they took the children's brain and put them into old people's brains, because the brain is immunologically different from the rest of your body. You don't need to tissue map it. You don't need to have tissue mapping of a kidney or this or that. You can just take one person's brain and put it into another's without any testing. So all these people, Parkinsonism improved, but all of them developed schizophrenia. Because the amount of chemicals a child's brain secretes is very different from what an elderly person's brain does. And when they developed stem cell technology, they discovered exactly the same thing. You could grow dopaminergic cells in a tube, you could put them into people's brains, their Parkinsonism improved, but 95% of them developed hallucinations and delusions because the amount of chemical that was being secreted was way above what an elderly person's brain could handle. We didn't understand this process. We didn't know how this was occurring. And therefore, we rushed in and produced more problems than we were trying to help. Now, that is going to be the problem. That are we going to be humble enough to understand that sometimes caution is necessary? That sometimes we need to do things much more carefully and waiting for more knowledge to emerge. Now, that space has to be filled with lots more research, lots more involvement of lots more people. And unless we do that, we will be confronted with a black box. And when we open that, instead of being the black box of ignorance, we'll be opening a Pandora's box of problems. I really, for medicine at least, the hope of better treatments for complex diseases like cancer and diabetes and hypertension and schizophrenia will be immensely helped by this. But at the same time, unregulated use of these, as has been pointed out, for purely business purposes. I don't know if some of you read the paper, some young girl in America has ordered that instead of being buried, she wants her body to be frozen at minus 60 degrees centigrade, because she's convinced that one day scientists will discover how to bring her back to life. So she wants herself to be buried in the hope that scientists bring the dead back to life. Are we talking about humanity or the good old jinns coming back, is what I would like to know.
So I think certain great conversations happened, especially I like the fact how we talked about divergence of certain kinds of critiques would come from non-scientists. I think any field of knowledge production really benefits from an expanding critique base. You know, that's how things get better. If more people are able to cut you down, I think that's very good and healthy for that kind of field. So fields which have too much jargon and fields which have too few adherents, actually false ideas can actually sustain for a much longer time, etc. And I think when you also mentioned, you know, poets, etc., and I think it's useful to mention that in the South Asian context, science treatises till very recently were always written in verse. Yeah. So it's kind of pretty interesting to note that they were always written in verse. During the Renaissance period in Europe, and also certain Bangla poetry at the turn of the last century, you have poetry which is at the bewilderment of science. For example, there's poetry when Neptune or Uranus, I don't remember which one, was discovered. There's poetry kind of responding in society to that. And I'll also kind of end by asking you guys to kind of remember what are the words of Rabindranath in the song Akash Bhara Surjo Tara. It is exactly this kind of wonder at the natural phenomena, right? So with that, I open it up to questions, and the two esteemed panelists are right here with us. Yeah.
What would you tell to the people who don't believe in evolution by natural selection? How would you convince them?
Evolution
That is
by
a fact.
natural selection যারা বিশ্বাস করে না তাদের কি বলবেন আপনি?
Well, this is like, as I said before, religion. I mean, religion works in a different plane. Like, people will not eat something for religious reason or ethical reason, even if it's not religion. So I'm not quarreling with religious or spiritual ideas. The world is full of diverse point of view with respect to spirituality and human origin, and it's no point arguing about this. But there is a rational discourse. There is obvious examples of DNA sequence similarity, let's say, even not between chimp and human being even, but the zebrafish. I just mentioned how my friend Kit Chang cloned the zebrafish skin color gene, or the fish skin color gene, and it was the same gene as the human being for skin color. So all this suggests that there is a great universal method. It does not preclude at all categorically the presence of a creator, because all this could have been conceptually. A lot of people think that this will inevitably leads to a very strict form of atheism. It's not true at all, because the question still remains that why did all this happen? Why did the Big Bang happen? What is the self-replicating molecule suddenly congregated into cellular structure? Is there any... Science works by Occam's razor. It doesn't invoke a new theory unless it's needed, but never denies the possibility of a new theory. It's just for analysis, it doesn't use it. So I'm not inviting or forcing anyone to shed their religion or their cherish ideas and beliefs, but would invite them to open their mind and look at the genome sequences which are available in NCBI, and there is no way they can deny that.
And if I could briefly add, for example, we also have to wonder, what does the question why answer? Or does it answer anything beyond answering what, when, where, how, etc.? Right? What does the question why answer at all, if anything?
And just to add to that, the government of Saudi Arabia has just opened one of the world's biggest genetics labs. So what they do politically is very different from what they do really.
And one of my teacher, a great geneticist, Nina Fedorov, took a job in one of the Saudi labs, and Francis Collins, who is actually #1 scientist in America and is the major person who sequenced the human genome, he has written a book proclaiming his very strong belief in Christian religion and even personal God and see. I mean, he believes in everything. Like a pastor believes, and yet he's the #1 scientist and the sequencer of human genome. So I think this kind of diversity is very much there. Abdus Salam, great physicist, and his colleague Weinberg actually is an atheist, and together they made very fundamental discovery in physics. But Salam remained a very devout believer.
So there's a question there. Yeah.
I have the mic.
Take it. Go ahead.
You mentioned that popularization of this idea. Siddhartha Mukherjee is not the only person who is a specialist, but this is also coming from the non-specialist, like this Israeli historian, military historian, Yuval Harari.
Yes.
He's written 2 books, Homo sapiens and then the Homo Deus,
Yes, of
which
course.
just came out.
Yes.
He has popularized, his books has been probably both translated into 30 languages and so on. It's a bestseller. The point I'm making, he's saying from Homo sapien to Homo Deus, which is human God.
Yes.
Okay. So with all this genetic modifications or whatever, I mean, he's saying happiness or whatever, it's just algorithm, nothing else. But the political economy of it, I mean, if this American, California-based, Silicon Valley-based, I mean, they are investing heavily because they want to live longer, 150 years or probably 500 years. They have started investing heavily on this. But what will happen? I mean, it sounds like to me we'll be witnessing the Hollywood films like Hunger Games, stuff like that. It's an extremely divided world.
It could happen, and it's interesting you've pointed this out. So there is a kind of a semi-scientific observation that when very smart people, somebody who is very good in maths marries another person who is very good in maths and have children, there is a higher fraction of those kids have autism. Because autism is a kind of an uncontrolled phenomenon where the idiot savant, there are ideas where autistic people have huge computational power. And this has suddenly gone up in the Berkeley, San Diego area, where a lot of these computer scientists are marrying another computer scientist. So one answer to this question is that in an unforeseen way, it could raise havoc. So that is one thing. We are not saying that it should be done or is desirable. But at least with genome editing and the total control understanding of the targeted changes in the human genome, you could construct a world of Homo Deus. In other words, you could find, theoretically speaking, now with the awesome computational power and the total power of genome editing, you could find the total allelic combination of what constitutes a Einstein, let's say, or a Mozart, and have an understanding. Doesn't mean that you're going to engineer that organization. But before, like cognitive biology and where poetry comes from, people used to think that it's a completely spiritual domain, and we couldn't possibly understand it with neurobiology. But now with neuroaesthetics and the idea of Samir Zaki, we discussed it day before yesterday. It is all coming under science. There is no area which has the aura of vitalism which cannot be understood with science. There is no such thing.
So we'll take the last two questions. We have someone there, and then Zain after that.
Okay, thanks. My name is Sarwar Chaudhary. I work for BRAC Institute of Governance and Development. I also write opinion pieces in Bangladeshi and Indian newspapers. I find it quite fascinating the way Mr. Chaudhary described, almost dismissed the notion of races in our understanding. So, I mean, obviously this is a very liberal position from a scientist, I mean, a very well-known scientist like him. And I think all the liberals will basically will fall into the same group. But interestingly, the public reason and the cognitional capacity of an average person has got certain limit. Probably he would not know all the evolutionary logics and everything. So we need, I mean, summarized information and summarized values to be imparted. And that's where social science comes in, and the practical campaigners and other people who construct the public discourse, they come in. So they are very important alongside the scientists. And the other thing is that, for example, nowadays we have seen in the US that the white nationalism, the underlying white nationalism has actually worked. In Great Britain, the Brexiteers are mostly ethnic English people. So at functional level, I mean, racism is coming back in maybe in one way or other. Although talking about even scientific racism is a taboo after the Nazi Holocaust and all these things. But what people see, for example, the statue of an average Bengali Austroasiatic and the statue of a Scandinavian, and many people find it difficult to reconcile how to treat them in the same way or whatever. So these are very complex questions. I mean, where other kind of value formulation has to come in. I mean, mere narrating a long scientific evolutionary history will not work. Thank you.
See, there are two very simple, one simple classroom test and one slightly more nuanced thing. One is if you calculate the number of ancestors of the people sitting in this room and calculate each one of us had 4 grandparents and blah, blah, blah. About 20 generations ago, our ancestors of the people in this room would be more than the population of Earth at that point of time. 500 years ago, let's say. So all of us are related to each other less than 500 years ago. That's one thing. If you take human cultural history of being, let's say, 4,000 years at best, and you take 3 generations every 100 years, that comes to a total of around 120 to 160 meiotic cell cycles. A tube of bacteria or Drosophila will do the same. A tube of bacteria will do this in about a day. One day. 120 cell divisions or 200 cell divisions. So what we have achieved in 3,000 years, a bacteria does in a few hours. That's why bacteria are smarter than us, and which is why they kill us. They are much more smarter. The rules are the same. So we really have to understand that there are fundamental laws of biology which promote relatedness. All life forms are related, not just human races. All life forms are related. And that is a fundamental fact. So whatever people achieve, we can do that with cognitive neuroscience. Why do brains evolve? And that's the other question I'm coming to. In India, there are langurs, as you know. I don't know if there are Hanuman langurs here. Do you get the black-faced langurs here? Black-faced. Similar. But the Indian Hanuman langur has a North Indian and a South Indian divide. Okay, as people, the previous thing was about Hindi hegemony, and I was reminded of that. The North Indian langur, one of them, will hold its tail in front when it jumps from tree to tree. The other one will hold its tail behind. There is no genetic difference between them, but when the two meet, it's fight to the death. They will not mate with each other, they will not talk to each other, they will not do anything. And the only difference is holding a tail in the front and the back. Genetically, they are identical. Now, why do complex behaviors of this kind of group specification occur? What does it mean for further genetic diversity? What does it mean for further speciation? We assume we are at the top of the pyramid. What if what we are actually at the bottom and the pyramid is actually going to evolve in the future? Now, these are questions which we need to understand. We are not the top of any pinnacle. We could be at the bottom as far as life form is concerned. And we are evolving towards something else. It's our vanity which gives us Homo sapiens sapien. The rest of the world thinks we are fools. The rest of the world means bacteria. We are just receptacles for bacteria. Each one of us has more bacteria than we have human cells. So,
so the last question.
Hi,
Yeah, there.
my name is Zain. So I missed the first part of the talk, but Vandana Shiva, who is an activist that is probably admired by many people in this room, once said that an Indian farmer who plants GMO seeds is a rapist. Is like a rapist. So I was wondering, as someone who is supportive of GMOs myself, how do you respond to that kind of just hyperbole? How do you have a conversation with people like that?
Yeah, Bandhana Shiva comes from a perspective of totally anti-technology Luddite. There is a brand of philosophy, Luddite. Luddites were people who used to break up whenever they saw any machine, they break it. And they believe that this is part of their religion. They have to break all machines. So the sort of thing she has said is not really based on any kind of rational understanding of biology, because biology creates infinite variety anyway. And the GMO is not creating variety even 100 times or even 1% of that thing. So she can't say that sort of thing at all. However, you can say that, look, GMO is not the most pressing need. The pressing need is nutrition. Pressing need is to give food. You might say that the vitamin shouldn't come from rice, but we have to create a world where there is always enough vegetable and carrots, so people are not getting everything. You can bring that sort of logic, and I go for it. I would support it. But the sort of thing she has said is just irrational, and in religious terms, one would say is a fundamentalist. She's a fundamentalist, anti-technology, Luddite person, as opposed to someone who sits down rationally. But she has a lot of followers. But extreme religious view held from any religion, not just one religion, also have zillions of followers. 70% of Americans think that there was no DNA in food, and scientists put DNA in it. Right? This was the first time DNA entered into a potato, is when an experiment was done and deliberately someone pipetted in DNA into a potato. This belief is held by a huge fraction of the US population. So Vandana Shiva is not that unusual. Huh?
So we can have one last question. I saw someone in the back. Yeah.
Sir, recently I have watched a documentary where they tried to say that genetically modified food, this might develop cancer. So what would be your answer in this regard?
Well, genetically modified food producing cancer. Now, that's a very interesting question. Let's go back to a bit. Now, life form is most diverse around the equator for a particular reason, that the strongest mutagenic thing is ultraviolet light. And the equator gets most ultraviolet light. That's why you get maximum genetic diversity around the equator. And the plants that grow at the equator also acquire properties of mutagens, because the life forms that live in the equator, the plant needs to protect itself against them. So the plants in the equator have strong mutagens for the animals that live on the equator. The strongest mutagen known one of the strongest mutagens known is coffee. Now, all of us have had coffee in the morning. How many of us have thought of the genetic mutation it has caused to us? A single smoke of a cigarette, as was published a few days ago, causes more epigenetic and mutational events in your lung than any technology could. A single puff. But we continue to use cigarettes all the time. A barbecued chicken, which we all had at various points during this, the mutagenic content of barbecued meat is equal to about 100 cigarettes each single piece. Will you stop making tandoori food? Unlikely. So we really have to understand how genes and environment interact and what is the role that we produce through technology. Some people go so far as to say the biggest disaster on Earth was the discovery of fire, because fire produced mutations in the natural world which caused havoc with the rest of the world. So the discovery of fire, which we think was the biggest invention, for the rest of the life form is the biggest single disaster. So we really have to know that.
Just wanted to add one thing, because I know we are pressed for time. Saying that GMO will cause cancer is like saying if you wear a red shirt, you're going to be killed, right? It's a bit like that. Of course, GMO may cause cancer if you put in a cancer-inducing gene in that GMO and people eat it and they get cancer, right? But people who say this don't really understand what GMO is. Like GMO is a method of introducing gene. You could put in a gene which gives you a lot of vitamin. It could put in a gene which prevents you from get cancer. There are hundreds and hundreds of genes you can put in, and each one would have a different character. There is not a unique, universal, omnipotent character of a GMO. People who say this is like the people who don't know the difference between a hybrid and a GMO, or they think of like the story I told before that scientists were the first people to put gene into food, you know? So I think we have to clear up these totally fantastic words which has absolutely no meaning, or has similar meaning as saying that if you have curly hair, you're going to die early, you know, that sort of thing. You know.
Okay. I just want to make one line comment about the issue of Vandana Shiva and all that. Because I think the issue is not the biological fundamentalism. It is the economic fundamentalism under which GMO works. The objection is more to that the use of GMO will put your agricultural security, your knowledge, enthralled to the big business interests and capitalism. That is the problem. If we say that every farmer who actually blends his seeds for the next crop is the same kind of scientist as the GMO, and they are on a level playing field and they are not asymmetrically privileged in terms of power, knowledge, experience, then it would be okay. But as long as you have this huge asymmetry that one man is a peasant and the other one is a World Bank scientist, then it is a problem.
I think that's a great note to end on, where we will probably have a more informed public discourse where gene in genetically modified organisms is different from gene in gene booth. So on that count, I would kind of call this to a close.
Thank you very much for being such a patient audience.